The rich father's mocking laughter echoed relentlessly in her mind. Grace tilted her head back and stared at the water-stained ceiling of the small diner. Another rejection email had just arrived in her inbox. "Thank you for your interest. We have decided to move forward with other candidates." She slammed her laptop shut with a heavy sigh. The sudden loud noise made Jimmy look up from the greasy counter, but the old man said nothing. He had known that defeated expression on her face for 2 solid years. Grace came to this quiet diner in a working-class Chicago neighborhood every single day, at the exact same hour, asking only for a simple black coffee and the silent permission to occupy the booth by the frosted window. Jimmy never charged her for more than 1 cup, even if she stayed the entire afternoon, typing away on her worn keyboard. Sometimes, he would quietly slide a piece of cherry pie across her table, without being asked, muttering about how a hard-working person could not possibly survive on an empty stomach. Grace knew how to read, write, and translate 3 languages with absolute fluency. Spanish was her native tongue, naturally inherited from her family. English she had perfected by watching old bootleg movie discs her grandmother used to buy at the Sunday flea market, repeating every single line until the foreign accent completely vanished from her tongue. German had come to her in a completely different and exhausting manner. It arrived when she was cleaning corporate offices late at night in downtown Chicago to pay for her internet bills and groceries. The wealthy executives would often speak German when they discussed sensitive matters they wanted to keep hidden from the invisible cleaning staff. Grace would scrub the marble floors and listen intently to their conversations. She wrote down strange, harsh-sounding words on paper napkins, looked them up online at the local library, and muttered them on the long bus ride home. No one paid for her expensive classes. She learned simply because she possessed sharp ears and a deep hunger for something more than the minimum wage they handed her. Now she could seamlessly read complex business contracts, translate dense technical manuals from German to English, and switch languages in her mind without a second thought. Yet, nothing in her daily reality changed. She remained a struggling young woman with no influential connections, no prestigious last name, and no expensive university degree to validate her immense knowledge. The important corporate doors stayed firmly shut, and when one barely cracked open, a man was usually there offering opportunities with sickening, inappropriate conditions. Grace always refused those offers, preferring to translate cheap restaurant menus over losing her dignity, even if it meant her bed touched the kitchen stove in her tiny apartment. She sighed deeply and opened her laptop again, facing a tedious manual about industrial machinery parts. The words were incredibly dull, but the assignment paid enough to keep the heating on during the bitter winter. She had been reading about steel bolts and gears for half an hour when the diner door suddenly swung open. Grace glanced up instinctively as the chilling wind rushed inside. A man stepped into the diner and froze in his tracks, looking as though he had wandered onto the wrong planet. He wore an incredibly expensive suit, but he wore it terribly. His silk tie was missing, the top buttons of his crisp shirt were undone, and his sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. His dark hair was a messy disaster, hinting at a long, frustrating day of driving with the windows rolled down. The man looked profoundly exhausted, not from physical labor, but from the soul-crushing weight of pretending everything was perfectly fine when it clearly was not. He walked heavily toward the counter, where Jimmy eyed him with obvious suspicion. The stranger asked politely for an Americano. Jimmy let out a dry, raspy laugh, stating firmly that they only had regular drip coffee or absolutely nothing at all. The man rubbed his tired face, nodded slowly in defeat, and accepted whatever warm beverage was available to him. Jimmy poured the steaming dark liquid into a chipped, thick ceramic mug and pushed it across the counter. The man paid with a crisp bill, took his coffee, and scanned the nearly empty room, eventually choosing the booth opposite Grace's table. He sat down as if his bones weighed a ton, took a slow sip, and closed his eyes in pure relief. Jimmy watched him closely with crossed arms, asking loudly if the coffee was terrible. The man opened his eyes and offered a faint, genuine smile, whispering that it tasted exactly like the black coffee his late grandmother used to brew on early mornings. Jimmy grunted softly, his rough demeanor softening just a fraction, and went back to wiping the counter with a damp rag. Grace tried desperately to focus on her glowing screen, but her eyes kept drifting toward the stranger. He completely clashed with the worn-out aesthetic of the neighborhood diner, yet he did not seem bothered by the cracked vinyl seats. He simply stared out the window at the busy, noisy street, holding the warm mug like a vital lifeline. 20 minutes passed in comfortable silence. The man remained completely still, pulling no phone from his pocket, just breathing in the quiet atmosphere, as if it were the safest sanctuary in the entire city. Grace kept pretending to read the English specifications, but the technical jargon blurred into meaningless shapes on the bright screen. Eventually, the man finished his drink and stared intently at the empty bottom of his mug. Jimmy walked over with a fresh pot of coffee and poured him another generous round, dropping a leftover corn muffin on a napkin beside the table. Jimmy muttered that the food was completely on the house for people who clearly needed a desperate break from the harsh world. The man took a slow, deliberate bite, closing his eyes in silent, profound appreciation for the simple gesture of kindness. Grace felt a strange flutter in her chest, a sudden mix of profound curiosity and deep empathy for a total stranger. Her laptop suddenly pinged loudly with a new email from her demanding freelance client. The message aggressively insisted that the 15-page translation be finished by 8 o'clock the next morning, without fail. Grace checked the dusty wall clock. It was nearly 6 o'clock in the evening. She forced her tired eyes back to the screen, but the complicated mechanical terminology made zero sense to her exhausted brain. 10 minutes later, she heard soft footsteps and looked up to find the stranger standing near her table. He wore an apologetic expression and gently asked if he could offer some assistance, mentioning he had accidentally seen her struggling with the complex engineering terms on her display. Grace instinctively pulled her laptop closer, a protective gesture born from years of dealing with men who expected something in return for their uninvited help. The man immediately raised his hands in a peaceful, non-threatening gesture, assuring her he meant no intrusion whatsoever. He explained calmly that he worked extensively with industrial manufacturing equipment and might know the exact terminology she was desperately searching for. Grace studied his face carefully, searching for the usual arrogant smirk or the inappropriate lingering gaze, but she found absolutely none of those warning signs. She saw only a genuinely tired man offering a small favor, with zero hidden expectations attached to his words. She hesitated for a brief moment, but the looming deadline and her mounting frustration finally won out. She gestured to the empty chair across from her, challenging him to define a highly specific bearing used in high-speed turbines. The man smiled softly, sat down while maintaining a respectful distance, and leaned forward to read the English text. His dark eyes scanned the dense paragraphs quickly, his brow furrowing in deep, professional concentration. Within seconds, he explained the exact mechanical concept, in clear, accessible language, offering the precise English and Spanish industrial equivalents, without a single ounce of condescending superiority, in his smooth voice. For the next 40 minutes, they worked together in a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. He explained complicated stress tolerances and thermal dynamics, while she rapidly typed the flawless translations into her document. It was a bizarre but wonderful experience for Grace to collaborate with someone who treated her strictly as an intellectual equal. She found herself relaxing her guarded posture, asking detailed questions without any paralyzing fear of sounding uneducated. Whenever she corrected his understanding of a subtle linguistic nuance, he accepted her expertise with genuine gratitude. When they finally completed the most difficult section, Grace leaned back in her chair and offered him a sincere, heartfelt thank you. The man shrugged modestly, claiming the mental distraction was exactly what he needed to escape his own complicated reality. Grace, feeling bolder than usual, asked what kind of terrible problems a man in such an expensive suit could possibly have. He smiled with a touch of deep sadness, replying that his problems were exactly the same as everyone else's, merely dressed in much finer clothing. He introduced himself as Samuel, extending a well-manicured hand that bore faint, faded scars from working with actual tools. Grace shook his hand firmly, introducing herself as a freelance translator who practically lived in neighborhood coffee shops trying to make ends meet. They spent the remainder of the evening talking about their completely different, yet surprisingly parallel lives. Samuel confessed that his family owned a massive manufacturing empire in the city, but he despised the endless corporate politics and the wealthy socialites he was forced to entertain. He preferred the quiet solitude of the engineering lab over the loud, fake laughter of luxurious boardrooms. Grace shared her own struggles, her deferred dreams of becoming an international interpreter, and the harsh reality of being entirely self-taught in a world obsessed with expensive paper degrees. Samuel listened with an intensity that made Grace feel truly seen for the very first time in her adult life. When Jimmy finally announced he was locking the doors in 20 minutes, both of them looked around in absolute shock. The hours had slipped away like a fleeting dream. Samuel stood up reluctantly, apologizing profusely for taking up so much of her valuable working time. Grace quickly assured him that his presence had been a gift, not a burden. Before walking out into the freezing Chicago wind, Samuel hesitated nervously, then asked if she would be returning to the diner the following day. Grace smiled warmly, promising she would be there at her usual time. Samuel climbed into a sleek black car waiting on the corner, leaving Grace with a fluttering sense of unexpected hope. Over the next 14 days, their chance encounter blossomed into a beautiful, unbreakable daily routine. Samuel would arrive at the diner shortly after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, shedding his suit jacket and his corporate exhaustion the moment he stepped through the door. They would share the same corner booth, sometimes working in comfortable, productive silence, and other times talking passionately until the streetlights flickered on outside. Grace discovered that Samuel had studied engineering in Munich for 4 years, and when she casually replied to him in flawless, accentless German, his jaw literally dropped in sheer amazement. He praised her fierce dedication, calling her self-taught skills more impressive than any Ivy League education he had ever encountered. The more time they spent together, the more Samuel opened up about the suffocating pressure orchestrated by his demanding father. His mother had passed away when he was 17 years old, and since that tragic day, his father had rigidly controlled every aspect of the family empire. Samuel revealed with heavy guilt that his father was aggressively pushing him to marry Penelope, the glamorous daughter of their largest business investor, to secure a massive corporate merger. Grace felt a sudden, icy grip on her heart, recognizing the vast, insurmountable canyon that separated their two worlds. She understood the crushing weight of family obligation, having sacrificed her own youth to care for her ailing grandmother. One rainy Tuesday, Samuel arrived at the diner to find Grace engaged in a heated, frustrating phone call with a notorious client. She was fiercely defending her rates, refusing to complete 10 extra pages of complicated translation for absolutely no additional pay. When she finally hung up the phone in a burst of righteous anger, Samuel praised her unwavering boundaries, validating her professional worth in a way nobody ever had. His unwavering support gave Grace a profound sense of inner strength. Later that same week, Samuel nervously rubbed the back of his neck and asked if she would do him the honor of accompanying him to the Art Institute of Chicago on Sunday morning. Grace was genuinely stunned. For 2 weeks, they had existed in the safe, isolated bubble of Jimmy's diner. Going out into the real world felt terrifying and incredibly risky, but the hopeful, vulnerable look in Samuel's eyes made it completely impossible to say no. Sunday arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. Grace stood before her tiny, cramped closet, feeling a wave of deep insecurity wash over her. She owned absolutely nothing suitable for a date with a wealthy heir. She finally settled on a pair of well-kept dark jeans, her nicest white blouse, and her grandmother's delicate silver earrings, hoping her simple dignity would somehow be enough. She met Samuel on the massive stone steps of the museum at exactly 11 o'clock in the morning. When he saw her walking toward him, his entire face lit up with a breathtaking, genuine smile that instantly melted all her lingering anxieties. Without his stiff corporate armor, dressed casually in dark jeans and a soft blue sweater, he looked handsome, approachable, and completely hers. They wandered through the vast, echoing halls of the museum for hours, losing themselves in vibrant abstract paintings and classical sculptures. Samuel spoke passionately about how his late mother used to bring him here, teaching him to look beyond the surface of the canvas to find the hidden truth within. After leaving the quiet museum, they walked leisurely through Millennium Park, surrounded by loud street musicians, laughing families, and the towering, majestic skyline of Chicago. They stopped beneath the sprawling branches of a massive, ancient oak tree, away from the bustling crowds. Samuel turned to face her, his expression turning deeply serious. He confessed that the past 2 weeks with her had been the absolute best days of his adult life. He told Grace that when he was with her, he didn't have to pretend to be the perfect corporate heir. He could just be a man. Grace, her heart pounding furiously, admitted she felt exactly the same liberating safety with him. Samuel took a small, hesitant step closer, closing the distance between them until Grace could clearly see the tiny flecks of gold in his warm brown eyes. He gently cupped her face in his hands, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but she leaned forward instead. The kiss was slow, incredibly tender, and completely overwhelming. It felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey in the freezing cold. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling like foolish teenagers. Samuel rested his forehead against hers, taking a deep, ragged breath, before asking the terrifying question that would inevitably change everything between them. He told her about a highly exclusive, private family dinner his father was hosting the following Saturday evening at a famous Gold Coast restaurant. He pleaded with Grace to attend as his official partner, desperate to show her off and integrate her into his complicated reality. Grace immediately stiffened, her mind flooding with 1,000 rational reasons why entering his wealthy, judgmental world was a spectacular mistake. She knew exactly how people like his father viewed people like her. But as she looked at Samuel's hopeful face, she realized her love for him was vastly stronger than her fear of their judgment. She squeezed his hand tightly and bravely agreed to go. The entire week leading up to the dinner felt like a slow, agonizing march toward an inevitable execution. Grace tried her hardest to focus on her freelance translations, but her mind constantly replayed terrifying scenarios of wealthy socialites laughing at her humble background. Samuel called her multiple times a day, assuring her that it was just a small, intimate gathering with his father, Edward, and a few close business associates. However, Grace knew perfectly well that what constituted a casual dinner for a multimillionaire was vastly different from a meal at her local diner. On Saturday evening, she put on a simple, elegant navy blue dress she had bought second-hand years ago for a corporate interview. Samuel picked her up in his sleek luxury sedan at 7 o'clock sharp. He complimented her beautifully, his eyes shining with genuine admiration that made the cheap fabric of her dress feel like royal silk. They drove downtown to an incredibly exclusive restaurant located in the wealthy Gold Coast neighborhood. The exterior was entirely made of polished glass and dark mahogany, exuding a quiet, intimidating power. As they walked inside hand in hand, Grace felt the crushing weight of a dozen judgmental stares from the impeccably dressed patrons. A snobbish hostess immediately guided them to a lavish private dining room at the back, where the air was thick with the smell of expensive wine and arrogance. Sitting at the head of the long, beautifully decorated table was Edward, a formidable older man with silver hair and eyes as cold as a Chicago winter. Beside him sat Penelope, the blonde, heavily jeweled woman Samuel was supposed to marry, along with her wealthy father and a few other corporate executives. Samuel introduced Grace with unwavering pride. Edward did not even bother to stand. He simply offered a limp, dismissive handshake and swept his calculating eyes over her inexpensive dress and worn shoes, silently deeming her completely unworthy in a matter of seconds. Grace kept her spine perfectly straight, refusing to let his silent cruelty break her confidence. The dinner service began, and the conversation predictably revolved entirely around summer homes, exclusive country clubs, and massive corporate acquisitions. Grace sat quietly, ordering the simplest roasted chicken on the French menu, acutely aware of Penelope's condescending smirks. Halfway through the main course, Penelope turned to Grace with a sickly sweet, poisonous smile, asking loudly what exactly a freelance translator did to survive in such an expensive city. When Grace calmly explained her work, Penelope laughed a high, mocking sound, loudly pitying Grace for lacking a formal university education. The other executives chuckled softly, their amusement making the luxurious room feel incredibly suffocating and small. Then, the true humiliation began. Assuming Grace was merely a poorly educated local girl, Edward leaned over and began speaking rapidly in fluent, aristocratic German to Penelope and her father. He casually remarked that Grace was tragically poor, that her cheap clothing was a severe embarrassment, and that Samuel was merely going through a ridiculous, rebellious phase. Penelope responded enthusiastically in the same language, mocking Grace's background and predicting Samuel would throw her back into the gutter within a month. Samuel, deeply engrossed in a technical conversation with the man on his left, was completely oblivious to the vicious, linguistic assassination happening right across the table. Grace sat perfectly still, taking a slow, steady sip of her sparkling water. The anger bubbling inside her chest was entirely cold and calculated. She waited patiently for Edward to finish his cruel, snobbish assessment of her worth. Then, she gently set her crystal glass down, looked Edward directly in his cold eyes, and spoke. Her German was absolutely flawless, sharper and more grammatically perfect than anything Edward had managed. She calmly agreed with him, stating in German that yes, she was indeed poor, and her clothes were certainly not designer labels. But she possessed something far more valuable than his inherited wealth: genuine, unshakable integrity. The deafening silence that instantly fell over the private dining room was magnificent. Edward froze completely, his fork hovering inches from his mouth, his face draining of all color. Penelope looked as if she had just been slapped across the face with a brick. The other executives stared at Grace in sheer, unfiltered shock. Samuel turned around, instantly sensing the massive shift in the room's atmosphere, and realized exactly what his brilliant partner had just done. Grace did not break eye contact with Edward, continuing in perfect German to explain that his son loved her for her mind and her spirit, things that his massive bank account could never, ever purchase. Edward slowly placed his silver fork on his expensive china plate. The initial shock on his wrinkled face slowly morphed into a grudging, reluctant respect. He stared at the fierce young woman sitting across from him, and finally let out a loud, booming laugh that startled everyone at the table. He switched back to English, completely ignoring a humiliated Penelope, and praised Grace for having more courage and intelligence than his entire board of directors combined. He formally apologized for his rude assumption. Samuel squeezed her hand firmly under the table, his chest swelling with immense pride. But Grace knew deep down that this battle was far from over. The few days following the dramatic dinner felt strangely quiet, like the eerie calm right before a massive, destructive hurricane. Samuel was absolutely ecstatic, repeatedly telling Grace how much his father had praised her fierce intellect after they left the restaurant. But Grace was not naive. She knew powerful men like Edward did not simply surrender their grand corporate plans because they were impressed by a clever comeback. Her dark suspicion was confirmed on a gloomy Wednesday afternoon when her cheap cell phone buzzed with an unknown caller ID. It was Edward, his voice entirely stripped of the previous evening's amusement, demanding she meet him at his downtown corporate office the next day at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Grace told no one about the ominous phone call. She rode the rattling subway train into the loop, staring blankly at the gray cityscape blurring past the dirty windows. She navigated the intimidating, marble-floored lobby of the massive skyscraper and rode the silent elevator all the way up to the 15th floor. Edward's corner office was a terrifying monument to absolute wealth and ruthless power, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vast expanse of Lake Michigan. Edward sat behind a massive oak desk, wearing a dark, bespoke suit, and motioned for her to sit in the solitary leather chair placed intentionally lower than his own. He did not bother with pleasantries. Edward leaned forward, folding his manicured hands, and casually offered Grace exactly $500,000 to completely sever all ties with his son. He slid a sleek, embossed business card across the polished wood, instructing her to call his private lawyer to arrange the immediate wire transfer. He spoke to her not with overt malice, but with a terrifying cold logic. He argued that the money would pay for the expensive university certifications she desperately wanted, allowing her to escape her cramped apartment and build a comfortable, independent life. He chillingly predicted that her vast differences from Samuel would eventually breed bitter resentment anyway. Grace stared at the small white card, the massive sum of money echoing loudly in her head. $500,000 was a sum so astronomically high it could instantly erase every single financial terror she had ever known. She thought about her worn-out shoes, the drafty windows in her apartment, and the agonizing fear of missing a rent payment. But then she pictured Samuel's warm smile, his unwavering support, and the safe haven they had built together in Jimmy's diner. She picked up the lawyer's expensive card, looked Edward straight in the eye, and slowly tore it into tiny, unrecognizable pieces, letting them flutter gently into his polished metal trash can. She told the billionaire that his money was completely worthless compared to the profound respect and love she shared with his son, then turned and walked out of the towering building with her head held incredibly high. As soon as she returned to her neighborhood, she immediately called Samuel and told him every single detail of his father's despicable bribe. Within 20 minutes, Samuel arrived at her apartment, his face pale with furious, uncontainable rage. Against her desperate pleas for caution, Samuel stormed out to confront the man who had tried to purchase his future. That night, Samuel officially resigned from his lucrative position in the family empire, walking away from millions without a second glance. The transition to a normal working-class life was not magically easy. Samuel moved into a tiny, run-down apartment down the street from Grace, bringing only his clothes and his personal savings. It was during this incredibly stressful period that they leaned heavily on the kindness of ordinary people. Grace's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, a sweet widow who loved baking, often brought them warm casseroles, sensing the young couple was struggling to adapt. Mrs. Higgins would sit in Grace's kitchen, sharing wise, comforting stories about surviving hard times through sheer stubborn love, reminding them that true wealth was measured by the people who stood by you during the fiercest storms. Meanwhile, Samuel reached out to his old university roommate, a cheerful, brilliant guy named Marcus, who had started a small, struggling green energy startup on the south side of the city. Marcus enthusiastically offered Samuel a modest engineering position. The salary was barely a fraction of his previous corporate income, and the office was practically falling apart. But for the first time in his entire life, Samuel was building something he actually believed in. He came home every evening with grease on his hands and a bright, untroubled smile on his face. Grace's translation business slowly expanded through Marcus's local industry connections, providing them with just enough stability to breathe easily. Despite their newfound happiness, the gaping hole left by Edward's absence weighed heavily on Samuel's heart, even if he bravely refused to admit it out loud. Grace often caught him staring blankly at the wall when a certain song played on the radio, or completely zoning out during holiday weekends. She knew Samuel loved his father, despite the older man's ruthless, manipulative behavior. Grace quietly hoped that time would eventually soften the bitter resentment between them, but she also fully accepted that they might never hear from Edward again. They were surviving on their own terms, completely free from toxic expectations, and for now, that hard-won freedom was entirely sufficient. Exactly 6 months after the massive fallout, Samuel's phone violently vibrated on the kitchen counter early on a Sunday morning. He stared at the caller ID in pure shock, before slowly pressing the device to his ear. It was Edward, his voice sounding shockingly frail, tired, and entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. He begged Samuel to come to the family estate in Winnetka, strictly requesting that Grace accompany him. Samuel initially refused, wanting to protect their fragile peace, but Grace gently placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. She understood that running from the past would only give it more power over their beautifully constructed future. They drove to the massive, sprawling suburban mansion in complete, nerve-wracking silence. Edward met them at the heavy oak doors, looking as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of months. He did not lead them into his intimidating office, but instead guided them into a dusty, unused sunroom at the back of the house. On the small wooden table sat a worn leather photo album. Edward opened it with trembling hands, pointing to a faded photograph of a stunningly beautiful woman with a fierce, rebellious smile, standing next to a very young, incredibly happy Edward. He looked up at them with tears shining in his tired eyes. Edward confessed that his late wife, Margaret, had actually grown up in a tiny, impoverished apartment in a rough neighborhood, the daughter of a hard-working mechanic and a seamstress. He explained that when he first brought Margaret home, his own wealthy father had viciously threatened to disinherit him, just as Edward had done to Samuel. Edward's voice completely broke, as he admitted that the years he spent fighting for Margaret's honor were the absolute best, most authentic years of his entire life. When she tragically died, the overwhelming grief had somehow twisted him into the exact same ruthless, class-obsessed tyrant he had once deeply despised in his own father. He turned directly to Grace, his voice barely a whisper, and told her that when she had fiercely defended her dignity in perfect German, refusing to take his insulting bribe, he saw Margaret's exact same unstoppable fire burning in her eyes. He formally, deeply apologized for his horrific arrogance and begged for their forgiveness, completely abandoning his immense pride. Grace looked at the crying billionaire, seeing not a terrifying corporate giant, but a deeply broken man desperate to reclaim the only family he had left. She reached out, gently took his trembling hand, and promised they would try to slowly rebuild their relationship, provided he completely respected their independence. 3 months later, the world had fundamentally shifted in the most wonderful ways. Edward had kept his solemn promise, completely stepping back and allowing Samuel to thrive at Marcus's humble startup without any corporate interference. Furthermore, Edward had officially hired Grace to manage the international communications department for his company's European expansion. She now had a beautiful, sunlit office downtown, and the company happily sponsored the expensive, formal language certifications she had always dreamed of earning. She was finally being properly compensated for her incredible linguistic talents, respected as a brilliant professional rather than dismissed as an uneducated neighborhood girl. One snowy Friday evening, Samuel walked into Jimmy's diner, where Grace was sipping her usual black coffee after a long day at the corporate office. Jimmy smiled broadly, sliding 2 massive slices of cherry pie across the counter before retreating to the kitchen. Samuel slid into the booth opposite her, looking exactly as he had on that very first day, but completely devoid of the crushing exhaustion. He reached across the scratch table, pulled a small velvet box from his coat pocket, and asked her to build a permanent, beautiful life with him. Grace laughed through joyful tears, nodding vigorously as he slipped the simple, elegant ring onto her finger. Life has a fascinating way of teaching us that genuine value is never found in the thickness of a wallet or the prestige of a family name, but rather in the quiet, unyielding strength of a person's character. When you have walked a long path full of hardships, you learn quickly that the superficial markers of success, expensive clothes, grand titles, and fancy dinners, can easily mask a deeply impoverished spirit. True wealth resides in a person's ability to maintain their dignity when the world attempts to make them feel small, and in their courage to love fiercely despite the crushing weight of societal judgment. We often spend our youth blindly chasing validation from closed doors, mistakenly believing that climbing the rigid ladders built by others will eventually bring us peace. Yet, the most profound joy is often discovered when we boldly refuse to compromise our core integrity, choosing instead to build our own tables where everyone is equally welcome. Forgiveness, even toward those who have deeply wronged us out of their own blinded grief, is the ultimate bridge to freedom. In the end, it is the honest connections we forge, stripped of all pretense and fueled by mutual respect, that truly endure the harsh tests of time.